All right, folks, sorry to keep you waiting on this by a little bit, but I did have a test to take. I literally just came from that, okay, and we're doing this now. So, tonight, as you know, at 6 p.m., the Tucker Carlson, Vladimir Putin, I should say, interview dropped. It is absolutely tearing up the media world tonight, and I figured on this stream, since we haven't been live for a while, we might as well react to it. Now, I have been seeing that a lot of other commentators who have been trying to react to this have gotten either guideline striked or copyright flagged or whatever. So we're going to take a couple precautions tonight, and I think we should be fine, but we'll be doing that as well as giving you a couple of live updates on the Nevada GOP caucus. Now, there's not many updates to really give you there because Donald Trump is running uncontested, but still, regardless, we'll do both. They're both happening at the same time. So without further ado, stay tuned. Let's do this. And we are live tonight from the great state of Florida. Welcome, everyone, to the momentous reaction stream to the Tucker Carlson Vladimir Putin interview. Before we get into this, let me just say that, folks, as I'm sure you could expect, we are taking a decent risk by trying to react to this on YouTube. So I want to say a couple of things. First and foremost, be sure to leave a like on the stream, subscribe to the channel if you are new. Just overall, you can show your support that way. Also, feel free to support the show via these super chats. And in the case that anything happens, like I said, I think we'll be fine. But in case anything happens, I do have my Rumble linked down in the description. Actually, let me check. Let me make sure. Yeah, it is linked. Okay, so, you don't have to go subscribe right now or click off or anything, but we are streaming to both platforms. So if anything happens to this stream, you know where to find me. We are also live on Twitter/X. So all the places, all that stuff. So yeah, again, before I begin, be sure to leave a like, super chat, and in case you know where to find me elsewhere if anything happens to this stream. With that said, ladies and gentlemen, I don't have much more to say, so let's just get right into this. Tucker Carlson obviously shaking up the entire world by doing the thing you're not allowed to do in the American news media, which is, of course, journalism, right? How dare you sit down with a world leader like journalists for generations have done? That is, of course, terrible and awful. Why is it exactly that they don't want to hear you listen to Vladimir Putin when he's speaking to Tucker Carlson? Well, let's take a listen tonight, folks, and find that out, okay? But again, as I said before, and this maybe this will help us not get taken down, right? We can have other things going on the screen. There is also a Nevada Republican caucus currently going on. Nikki Haley did not even choose to appear on the caucus ballot, so this is Donald Trump essentially running uncontested, although who knows? None of these candidates, right? Nobody beat Nikki Haley on Tuesday, so maybe Donald Trump has to watch out for that. That's obviously a joke. Trump will be fine. I'm sure someone will vote for nobody as they did on Tuesday, but I don't think that will be much of an issue. So there we have it, folks. Let's get into this. First, though, we do have a super chat. $1 for $1 for $2 says, is Despicable Me implicitly right-wing? Well, I would say it probably mostly is in many regards. Now, I'm sure a lot of people would make the comparison between Gru and Vladimir Putin, which is ironic because we're watching this thing, so that's a funny thing to think about, but I would probably say so. And Eric Peterson for $10, thank you very much, says, does Tucker get an interview with Biden or the other Vlad? No, absolutely not. In fact, before we begin, one more thing I want to point out. Everyone's just saying, oh, Tucker is running propaganda for Putin here. Tucker openly requested an interview with Zelensky as well, and guess what? He declined. So how dare he want to interview both world leaders in this war and only one of them answered? That is obviously, of course, Tucker Carlson's fault. All right, with that said, I don't want to keep anyone any longer. Let's start to get into this. I will say, because copyright, and also I want to maybe leave a portion that you can go personally watch on Tucker's channel. I'm going to skip the about first half hour of this. Now, this is not to say that there's nothing to listen to, but he mainly goes into sort of a historical argument as to why he believes Ukraine is a rightful part of Russia. He brings up that Ukraine is the historical homeland of the Russian state, and a lot of it's kind of like history jargon. That's why I find it, maybe at least for this channel, a little bit less interesting than the modern arguments he has to make. And for the record, I will say, I don't even necessarily agree with what Putin said in the beginning, in the sense that while it may be true, because this is the same argument I make with the Native Americans, while it may be true that the Russian state was born in Kiev or however people want to say it these days, that doesn't necessarily mean, well, at least my stance of the world does not have to do with people's historical claims on stuff. I look at the world in terms of, here's the situation we have now. How do we make the best of it? With that said, though, on the other hand, it is an interesting argument when you think about it from an American perspective, right? And Pat Buchanan wrote about this when the war first broke out. That is their side of the world. It is ultimately their war. This idea of, does Ukraine really belong to an independent entity, or is it Russian? That is such a centuries-old conflict that in many ways you could argue America doesn't particularly need to be involved in at least in the way that it is. So that's an argument to be made. But yeah, that's basically what Putin, in a very long-winded sense, says in the beginning of this interview. We'll also point out one more thing, and then we'll start, I promise. One more thing is that when you listen to him explain it, he basically tells the entire history of the Russian state, which is very impressive from a mental perspective. And so here's the last thing I will say, is that regardless of whatever you think of Putin, and contrary to what people think, I support the guy or I love the guy or whatever, but I think it should be pointed out, right, that when you listen to this interview, he is undoubtedly a lot smarter and sharper than virtually anyone leading America at the current moment, okay? And you'll hear this throughout the rest of this interview. Has a response to everything, has an answer to everything, and the reason I point that out is because it does tell you a little bit of something about how the people who are in charge of the East are much smarter than the people in charge of our country. Doesn't mean they're good or their values are good, right? Because I think the same is true of Xi. I think Xi Jinping is a smart guy. Doesn't mean he's a good guy, but he's a smart guy, right? And just the sheer competence difference between Eastern leadership and Western leadership, I think tells you a lot about why America has declined off the world stage, arguably in the last couple of decades. But all right, with that said, folks, let us finally begin our reaction to this. I will try to pause at a decent amount just so that we don't get taken down or whatever. But all right, here we go. I also flipped the interview, by the way, so that way, let's try to trigger as few YouTube filters as possible. Okay, let's get into this.
Everything happened just as he had said.
Of course, it did come true, and you've mentioned this many times. I think it's a fair point, and many in America thought that relations between Russia and the United States would be fine with the collapse of the Soviet Union and the end of the Cold War, that the opposite happened. But you've never explained why you think that happened, except to say that the West fears a strong Russia, but we have a strong China the West does not seem very afraid of. What about Russia do you think convinced policymakers they had to take it down.
Запад боится сильного Китая больше, чем сильной России.
The West is afraid of strong China more than it fears a strong Russia, because Russia has 150 million people and China has 1.5 billion population, and its economy is growing by leaps and bounds, or 5% a year. It used to be even more. But that's enough for China. As Bismarck once put it, potentials are the most important. China's potential is enormous. It is the biggest economy in the world today in terms of purchasing power parity and the size of the economy. It has already overtaken the United States quite a long time ago, and it is growing at a rapid clip. Let's not talk about who is afraid of whom. Let's not reason in such terms. And let's get into the fact that after 1991, when Russia expected that it would be welcomed into the brotherly family of civilized nations, nothing like this happened. You tricked us. I don't mean you personally when I say you. Of course, I'm talking about the United States. The promise was that NATO would not expand eastward, but it happened 5 times. There were 5 waves of expansion. We tolerated all that. We were trying to persuade them. We were saying, please don't. We are as bourgeois now as you are. We are market economy and there is no communist party power. Let's negotiate. Moreover, I have also said this publicly before. There was a moment when a certain rift started growing between us. Before that, Yeltsin came to the United States. Remember, he spoke in Congress and said the good words. God bless America. Everything he said were signals. Let us in. Remember the developments in Yugoslavia before the Yeltsin was lavished with praise? As soon as the developments in Yugoslavia started, he raised his voice in support of Serbs, and we couldn't but raise our voices for Serbs in their defense. I understand.
Okay, so what he's bringing up here is a theme you'll find a lot in this interview and you don't really hear a lot of Western media talk about, which is the fact that, and this is simply true, like this is an objective historical fact, even the neocons really can't argue against it, even if they disagree with Putin as a leader or his values or whatever, which is that repeatedly through the years, he has sought positive relations with the United States. He's tried many times, and essentially, and this is an objective fact, what we have done repeatedly is turn him away, right? He tried to join NATO, there were talks of unions and all this stuff, and because of, I don't know what exactly it is, ideological difference, some people being stuck in the Cold War, whatever it is, repeatedly we turn him away and away, and now we're in a scenario today, and you'll see that later, where Russia has been moved right into the arms of China, okay? And I think any way you cut it, the strategy post-Soviet Union, obviously the Soviet Union, that's one thing. Post-Soviet Russia, with constantly trying to antagonize them as the United States, has not been good. It has not been smart, and it has not helped the United States. People say, oh, but Putin is a dictator. We'll talk about a little bit, maybe that more in a second, but just keep that in mind. This is a theme that gets stressed repeatedly in this interview, and it's not just a talking point on Putin's part, because you can research the record of this. All of that is true. He repeatedly tried to reach out to the West. We denied up until like even this point with Ukraine, and now what's going on? Russia is acting on their own accord, number one, but then also number two, they're forming a stronger and stronger alliance with China, and that is not helping the United States, and that is not a good thing for us. Let me just say that.
And that there were complex processes underway there. I do. But Russia could not help raising its voice in support of Serbs, because Serbs are also a special and close to us nation, with Orthodox culture and so on. It's a nation that has suffered so much for generations. Well, regardless, what is important is that Yeltsin expressed his support. What did the United States do? In violation of international law and the UN Charter, it started bombing Belgrade. It was the United States that let the genie out of the bottle. Moreover, when Russia protested and expressed its resentment, what was said? The UN Charter and international law have become obsolete. Now everyone invokes international law, but at that time they started saying that everything was outdated. Everything had to be changed. Indeed, some things need to be changed, as the balance of power has changed. It's true, but not in this manner. Yeltsin was immediately dragged through the mud, accused of alcoholism, of understanding nothing, of knowing nothing. He understood everything, I assure you. Well,
Думаю, ладно, все.
I became president in 2000. I thought, okay, the Yugoslav issue is over, but we
For those who don't know, Boris Yeltsin was the president of Russia post-Soviet Union before Putin. Okay, in case anyone asks.
should try to restore relations.
Которую Россия.
Let's reopen the door that Russia had tried to go through.
И больше того,
And moreover, I said it publicly, I can reiterate.
в Кремле с уходящим от власти Белым
At a meeting here in the Kremlin with the outgoing President Bill Clinton, right here in the next room, I said to him, I asked him,
Если бы Россия поставила вопрос о вступлении в НАТО,
Bill, do you think if Russia asked to join NATO, do you think it would happen?
вдруг он сказал, ты знаешь,
Listen to
это
this.
интересно.
Suddenly he said, you know, it's interesting. I think so.
Встретились уже на
But in the evening, when we met for dinner, he said, you know, I've talked to my team. No, it's not possible now.
Можете спросить у него, но я думаю, наше.
You can ask him. I think he will watch our interview. He'll confirm it. I wouldn't have said anything like that if it hadn't happened. Okay,
Were you
well, it's
sincere?
impossible now.
Would you have joined NATO?
So, you know, again, this is not a blanket stream defending Putin or everything he's ever done. But that's very interesting, right? In the 1990s, this is before Crimea, this is before any of the modern drama between our two nations, Putin reached out to the United States, at the time the president was Clinton, and asked about joining NATO. Okay? Now, in fairness to Bill Clinton, perhaps an argument could be made that that's not necessarily the smartest idea, because you look at Ukraine today, for instance, would all of NATO have to go to war in Ukraine? You know, Russia has its own territorial disputes and issues, and at the time, maybe after the fall of the Soviet Union, you know, there wasn't certainty if Russia would be a stable state. So I understand all of those things. I'm not necessarily saying at the time in the 1990s, it would have been smart to admit Russia into NATO. However, I think what it does show is that Putin, at least historically, has not been a guy who's totally closed off to the West. In fact, he's tried repeatedly to make Russia into a Western power. And I think when you kind of understand the fact he sort of in some ways emulates the Tsar, he kind of wants to return to the pre-Soviet Russia, imperialist Russia in the sense, even kind of dons similar flags and themes and all that. You know, I clearly there has been an effort on his part to go in that direction. Now, why do I say that the United States, you don't have to admit them into NATO necessarily, but why do I say the United States should have tried to listen to Russia? Because again, there are only basically two alternatives in this world. A Russia that is closer to the United States and the West, or a Russia that is closer to China. If you isolate Russia, which we have done long before this war, you will push them right into the arms of China. And as most conservatives agree, China is our true and real enemy in most regards, right? Then it's stupid to take one of the world's largest global powers and isolate them for basically no real justifiable reason. I mean, that's the truth. They can bring up all this, that, oh, it's because Vladimir Putin is a dictator. Well, he's bad because he's a dictator. Of course, this is while the neocons support dictatorships in one-party states in Saudi Arabia, for instance, in Ukraine, in a lot of places around the world. So that argument has always been bogus to me. I don't care whether or not Putin is democratically elected. He's not the leader of my country. He's the leader of Russia. Frankly, what should govern our foreign policy is not idealism, but pragmatism. Okay, that's the truth. Because the whole idea of spreading democracy around the world for so many decades has already failed us. We need a pragmatic foreign policy. And to me, the pragmatic foreign policy says you have these two big boys on the world stage, Russia and China. The lesser of the two evils there, the smaller enemy is Russia. So why not, you don't even have to add Russia into NATO necessarily, but why not try to pull Russia away from China, kind of keep them at distance? We did the opposite of that. The neocons claim this is smart, and they claim we know nothing about foreign policy for opposing. That's very stupid. Bill Clinton, at the very least, I'm not saying he had to admit Russia into NATO. He should have, though, at the very least, not been so adamant, and obviously the people after him, about just blanketly pushing Russia away from U.S. relations, and this is the result we have. It's true.
Послушайте,
Look, I asked the question, is it possible or not? And the answer I got was no. If I was insincere in my desire to find out what the leadership position was,
But if he had said yes, would you have joined NATO?
если бы он
if he had said yes, the process of rapprochement would have commenced, and eventually it might have happened if we had seen some sincere wish on the other side of our partners. But it didn't happen. Well, no means no. Okay,
давайте будем
fine.
Why do you think that is? Just to get to motive, I know you're clearly bitter about it. I understand. But why do you think the West rebuffed you then? Why the hostility? Why did the end of the Cold War not fix the relationship? What motivates this from your point of view?
Good question.
Вы сказали, что
You said I was bitter about the answer. No, it's not bitterness. It's just a statement of fact. We're not bride and groom, bitterness, resentment. It's not about those kind of matters in such circumstances. We just realized we weren't welcome there, that's all. Okay, fine. But let's build relations in another manner. Let's look for common ground elsewhere. Why we received such a negative response, you should ask your leaders. I can only guess why. Too big a country with its own opinion and so on. And the United States, I've seen how issues are being resolved in NATO.
ну,
I still really don't know.
видел, как решают.
I will give you another example now concerning
Еще
Ukraine.
один из примеров сейчас приведу, касающийся
The US leadership exerts pressure, and all NATO members obediently vote,
послушно голосуют. Даже если им
even if they do not like something.
я скажу в этой связи, что происходило с Украиной.
Now, I'll tell you what happened in this regard with Ukraine in 2008, although it's being discussed. I'm not going to open a secret to you, say
Мы пытались
anything new.
по-разному выстроить отношения.
Nevertheless, after that we tried to build relations in different ways.
События,
For example, the events in the Middle East, in Iraq.
мы
We
очень
were building relations with the United States in a very soft, prudent, cautious manner. I repeatedly raised the issue that the United States should not support separatism or terrorism in the North
на
Caucasus.
Северном Кавказе.
And newsflash, we shouldn't have. You look at Iraq and why part of why that war was such a disaster, well, and I'll talk about Syria in a second, but
Но все равно продолжали это делать.
But they continue to do it anyway.
Политическая
And
поддержка,
political support,
информационная
information
поддержка,
support,
финансовая
financial support,
поддержка, даже
even
военная.
military support came from the United States and its satellites for terrorist groups in the Caucasus.
Террористические формирования в
I once raised this issue with my colleague, also the President of the United States. He says, "It's impossible. Do you have proof?" I said, "Yes." I was prepared for this conversation, and I gave him that proof.
Он посмотрел.
He looked at it, and you know what he said? I apologize, but that's what happened. I'll quote.
Он говорит,
He says, "Well, I'm gonna kick their ass." We waited and waited for some response. There was no reply.
я говорю директору,
he's talking about George Bush, by the way. So that's not a surprising answer at all. Well, we're just gonna fight everyone and do everything. Yeah, it sums up Bush, right?
I said to the FSB director, write to the CIA, what is the result of the conversation with President?
есть разговор с президентом.
He wrote once, twice, and then we got a reply.
В архиве.
We have the answer in the archive.
ЦРУ пришел ответ.
The CIA replied,
Работали с
"We have been working with the opposition in Russia. We believe that this is the right thing to do, and we will keep on doing it."
смешно.
Just ridiculous.
Ну ладно, мы поняли, что
Well, okay. We realized that it was out of the question.
Forces in opposition to you. So you're saying the CIA is trying to overthrow your government.
ну, конечно, имелось в виду в данном
Of
случае.
course, they meant in that particular case the separatists, the terrorists who fought with us in the Caucasus.
Они их называли.
That's who they called the opposition.
Это вот второй момент.
This is
Okay, so to clarify, while Bush already had it's very typical, right? While Bush already had a million wars going on all around the world, we know Iraq, Afghanistan, all that stuff. He simultaneously was supporting the separatists who were trying to fight against Putin's government in Russia. So, you know, that says a lot about our regime change goals and how just stupid and reckless we are. And by the way, how would that, again, I asked this question, how would destabilizing Russia as they were trying to do, but Putin's a bad guy, Vince. There's a lot of bad guys around the world. Newsflash. The relevant question should be, how would that have helped the United States? Can anyone answer that? How would trying to destabilize everything else around the world while you're fighting the war in Iraq and Afghanistan have helped the United States? The answer is it wouldn't have. I said I would talk about Syria in a second because he brings up the question of Iraq. And it's interesting. This is an issue I was passionate about 8 years ago, like when I was in middle school, even long before I was super into politics, because I used to hear Tulsi Gabbard talk about it a lot. Like, this is a long time ago. Is this similar theme comes up in the Syrian civil war. Remember that? It's still kind of happening, not really, but remember that whole thing? So, in the Syrian civil war, the U.S. said, oh, well, ISIS is in Syria, so we need to take out ISIS. Remember that? Remember that whole situation? It's called the Islamic State of Iraq and Syria. That's what ISIS is abbreviated, right? Well, if you want to take out ISIS, wouldn't you think that, okay, well, Assad's government, he may be a dictator, oh, he's a bad guy, but he is against ISIS. He wants a stable Syria. The lesson we should have already learned from Iraq is when you destabilize a Middle Eastern country, you create terrorism. And very interestingly, Putin backed Assad in the Syrian civil war. Now, it's my stance, maybe it'll be a hot take, but if the U.S. was going to get involved in the Syrian civil war at all, the only reason should have been to also back Assad, okay? So that's one thing, and I've thought this long before this interview, that Putin was right about and we were wrong about, because while we were trying to quote-unquote fight ISIS, we were also funding the Syrian rebel groups trying to overthrow Assad, which, again, what does that have to do with fighting ISIS? Nothing. It actually creates a power vacuum for ISIS, right? And you'd have to imagine in many of these cases, the quote-unquote Syrian rebels that they were giving all these arms to, how many of them you think went to ISIS? Or how many of them you think were equally Islamic terrorists just like ISIS? We probably know the answer to that, right? So that is another example of A, stupid American foreign policy, but I would also argue B, a chance where Russia and the U.S. could have worked together at the common goal of eliminating ISIS. But of course, we didn't do that because I will reiterate this, and I think this is a central theme you realize from this interview. The people who dictate our foreign policy are just not smart. They are dumb. They are stupid people. That is simply a fact, and that's why we are at the place where we are. It's just the truth.
This is the second point. The third moment is a very important one. Is the moment when the U.S. missile defense system was created. The beginning. We persuaded for a long time not to do it in the United States. Moreover, after was invited by Bush Jr.'s father, Bush Sr., to visit his place on the ocean, I had a very serious conversation with President Bush and his team. I proposed that the United States, Russia, and Europe jointly create a missile defense system that we believe, if created unilaterally, threatens our security, despite the fact that the United States officially said that it was being created against missile threats from Iran.
Someone in chat said, oh, back the guy who gasses his own people. I never said that Assad was a good guy. He's obviously a brutal dictator, but is it the job of the U.S. to overthrow all the world's brutal dictators? Because there's a lot of them. In newsflash, there's a lot of them we support. Okay, there's a lot of them we support. I'm just going to throw out the name Saudi Arabia, but there's many others. There's plenty of those that we support. So don't come to me with this moral quandary of like, oh, but Assad was a bad guy. I never said he wasn't a bad guy. I never said Vladimir Putin wasn't a bad guy. But if your goal is to fight ISIS, then why are you spending half of your resources trying to overthrow Assad and actually giving arms directly or indirectly to ISIS instead of fighting ISIS? Because it's just a fact. By backing these Syrian rebels instead of Assad, we drug out the fight against ISIS way longer than it needs to be. Look at the two. Think about this for a second. Let me ask you that for a second. The two countries, again, it's the Islamic State of Iraq and Syria. That's what it's called. Why did ISIS appear in both of those two countries? It's because of us. That's a fact. It's because we tried to destabilize the regimes of both Saddam Hussein and Bashar al-Assad. And did those countries get freedom? Are either of those countries better off today? Or did ISIS overrun like half of both of those countries and we had to spend a bunch of time and resources and men fighting that? So that's, again, the point that I'm making here. And I think that's the difference between his foreign policy and our foreign policy. I listen to his foreign policy. It's not all of it is in the interest of the United States, and that's fine because he is Russian. He acts in the interest of Russia. However, you notice he has a very pragmatic approach to foreign policy. What is best for Russia? America's approach for foreign policy, why shouldn't that be pragmatic in terms of what is best for America? What is best at completing our objective? And if the objective is fighting ISIS, as it was in Iraq and Syria, and that's something Russia and America both agreed on, which is that they opposed ISIS, then why are you trying to overthrow Assad, who's also trying to fight ISIS? It's stupidity. Anyway.
That was the justification for the deployment of the missile defense system. I suggested working together, Russia, the United States, and Europe. They said it was very interesting. They asked me, "Are you serious?" I said, "Absolutely."
May I ask, what year was this?
I don't remember. It is easy to find out on the internet when I was in the USA at the invitation of a Bush senior. It is even easier to learn from someone I'm going to tell you about. I was told it was very interesting. I said, just imagine if we could tackle such a global strategic security challenge together. The world will change. We'll probably have disputes, probably economic and even political ones, but we could drastically change the situation in the world. He says yes, and asks, "Are you serious?" I said, "Of course."
I'll read super chats in a second.
We need to think about it, I'm told. I said, "Go ahead, please." Then Secretary of Defense Gates, former director of CIA, and Secretary of State Rice came in here, in this cabinet, right here at this table. They sat on this table. Me, the foreign minister, the Russian defense minister on that side.
Gaddafi? Yeah, that's
They
another
said to me,
example. You're right.
"Yes, we have thought about it. We agree." I said, "Thank God, great, but with some exceptions."
So twice you've described U.S. presidents making decisions and then being undercut by their agency heads. So it sounds like you're describing a system that's not run by the people who are elected in your telling.
Sounds very familiar.
That's right. That's right. In the end, they just told us to get lost. I'm not going to tell you the details because I think it's incorrect. After all, it was confidential conversation. But our proposal was declined. That's a fact. It was right then when I said, "Look, but then we will be forced to take countermeasures. We will create such strike systems that will certainly overcome missile defense systems." The answer was, "We are not doing this against you, and you do what you want," assuming that it is not against us, not against the United States. I said, "Okay, very well." That's the way it went. And we created hypersonic systems with intercontinental range, and we continue to develop them. We are now ahead of everyone, the United States and the other countries, in terms of the development of hypersonic strike systems, and we are improving them every day. But it wasn't us. We proposed to go the other way, and we were pushed back. Now, about NATO's expansion to the east. Well, we were promised no NATO to the east, not an inch to the east, as we were told. And then what? They said, well, it's not enshrined on paper, so we'll expand. So there were 5 waves of expansion, the Baltic states, the whole of Eastern Europe, and so on. And now I come to the main thing. They have come to the Ukraine, ultimately. In 2008, at the summit in Bucharest, they declared that the doors for Ukraine and Georgia to join NATO were open. Now about how...
Of course, this is while we denied Russia membership in Ukraine. I mean, in NATO. And yeah, that's always been stupid. Ukraine shouldn't be a part of NATO, especially given modern context and history, but it does make sense with this super chat right here that points out What the response to Tucker shows is that the West is silently... We're going to do super chats right now, okay, in case you're wondering, because I don't want to get too far behind with these. What the response to Tucker shows is that the West is silently at war with Russia. Whether they want to say it or not, it's a response you'd have for Iraq. And that's true. Yeah, we're definitely in a silent war, a Cold War again, you might want to say, right? But it is true. And again, it doesn't have to be that way. Because if China is the main enemy, then why are you fighting Russia? So, yeah, it's true. Christopher for 10 says, I will say from this interview that Putin is very passionate about his country and its history. There's nothing inherently wrong with that. I wish I could say the same about our leaders. Well, yeah, again, that reverberates back to one of my opening points, which was that whatever you think of this guy, he's a lot smarter than the people who run our country, okay? And, you know, frankly, he could talk circles around them, and it's not just him, right? I think Xi Jinping, same exact way, you know, and maybe it explains why the world order is changing the way it is. Eric Peterson for 10 says the money war in America is between the military-industrial complex and the NGOs, non-governmental organizations. NATO versus the MIC is two sides of the same coin. And that's very true, because NATO is entirely funded by the American military-industrial complex. Europe barely pays its full share, okay? Besides the US and maybe the UK, it's basically a protectorate that we subsidize, and so that's about accurate. Christopher for 5 says, Western and Eastern Europe have always been divided by religion and now ideology. It doesn't have to be this way. Well, yeah, especially after the fall of the Soviet Union. And again, when everyone's so concerned about China, right? That's what American conservatives are always telling us is so bad. And I tend to agree, right? Why are you fighting Russia? But that would make too much sense. That would be too pragmatic for American foreign policy, right? Like, that just makes too much sense. We can't do that. We have to chase weird, blind idealism that's not even consistent, and you know how it goes. Okay, let's continue this. Let's actually skip. Let me see. Let's see.
Where are the guarantees? None. So they started to develop the territory of Ukraine. Whatever is there, I have told you the background, how this territory developed, what kind of relations there were with Russia. Every second or third person there has always had some ties with Russia. And during the elections in already independent, sovereign Ukraine, which gained its independence as a result of the Declaration of Independence, and by the way, it says that Ukraine is a neutral state, and in 2008, suddenly the doors or gates to NATO were open to it. Oh, come on. This is not how we agreed. Now, all the presidents that have come to power in Ukraine, they relied on electorate with a good attitude to Russia in one way or the other. This is the southeast of Ukraine. This is a large number of people. And it was very difficult to dissuade this electorate, which had a positive attitude towards Russia. Viktor Yanukovych came to power, and how? The first time he won after President Kuchma, they organized a third round, which is not provided for in the constitution of Ukraine. This is a coup d'etat. Just imagine, someone in the United States wouldn't like the outcome.
In 2014?
Before that. No, this was before that. After President Kuchma, Viktor Yanukovych won the elections. However, his opponents did not recognize that victory. The US supported the opposition, and the third round was scheduled. What is this? This is a coup. The US supported it, and the winner of the third round came to power.
So look, this is Putin's side of the argument. So I would encourage everyone, for the sake of an open mind, to take everything he says with that grain of salt, that this is the other perspective, right? But with that said, what he's saying about Ukraine is true. And this is, these neocons, they still do this to this day. They claim what they're defending in Ukraine is democracy. While the United States has repeatedly tried to overthrow the democratically elected governments of Ukraine because the people voted for one that was more favorable to Russia. Okay, so it's not about democracy. It's not about democracy. Frankly, I might respect the neocons a little more if they were just honest about their intentions. If they just honestly said, this whole thing in Ukraine is about keeping Ukraine as a Western and American proxy state. And we don't care how we do it. We don't care if Ukraine's not actually a democracy, if they suspend freedom of speech, if they suspend elections, all that stuff, because this is by all means necessary. Okay? Frankly, I don't necessarily agree with that premise, but I would find that far more compelling and at least honest and interesting to debate than these people sitting here lying to you saying, it's about dictatorship versus democracy. That's a very narrow-minded view of the world. Geopolitics doesn't really actually work that way in reality. Okay? So just going to point that out.
Imagine if in the US something was
America
not to
never
someone's
left
liking,
the Cold
and
War.
the third round of
True.
election, which the US Constitution does not provide for, was organized. Nonetheless, it was done in Ukraine. Okay, Viktor Yushchenko, who was considered a pro-Western politician, came to power. Fine, we have built relations with him as well. He came to Moscow with visits. We visited Kiev. I visited too. We met in an informal setting. If he's pro-Western, so be it. It's fine. Let people do their job. The situation should have developed inside the independent Ukraine itself. As a result of Kuchma's leadership, things got worse and Viktor Yanukovych came to power after all. Maybe he wasn't the best president and politician, I don't know. I don't want to give assessments. However, the issue of the association with the EU came up. We have always been lenient to this.
Hey, Trump
Suit
is
yourself.
winning.
But when we read through the Treaty of Association, it turned out to be a problem for us, since we had a free trade zone and open customs borders with Ukraine, which under this association had to open its borders for Europe, which would have led to flooding of our market. We said, no, this is not going to work. We shall close our borders with Ukraine then. The customs borders, that is. Yanukovych started to calculate how much Ukraine was going to gain, how much to lose, and said to his European partners, I need more time to think before signing. The moment he said that, the opposition began to take destructive steps which were supported by the West. It all came down to Maidan and a coup in Ukraine.
So he did more trade.
So what he's talking about is, I guess, Ukraine was trying to join the EU, and Russia, for their own interests, said, no, we don't want that because you would, you know, it would hurt us economically, it would hurt us with trade and all that. So that's just, you know, that's just the context there of that conversation.
Trade with Russia than with the EU. Ukraine did.
Of course. It's not even the matter of trade volume, although for the most part it is. It is the matter of cooperation ties, which the entire Ukrainian economy was based on. The cooperation ties between the enterprises were very close since the times of the Soviet Union. One enterprise there used to produce components to be assembled both in Russia and Ukraine, and vice versa. They used to be very close ties. A coup d'etat was committed, although I shall not delve into details now, as I find doing it inappropriate, the US told us. Calm Yanukovych down, and we will calm the opposition. Let the situation unfold in the scenario of a political settlement. We said, all right, agreed, let's do it this way. As the Americans requested, Yanukovych did use neither the armed forces nor the police, yet the armed opposition committed a coup in Kiev. What is that supposed to mean? Who do you think you are? I wanted to ask the then US leadership.
With the backing of whom?
With the backing of CIA, of course. The organization you wanted to join back in the day, as I understand. We should thank God they didn't let you in. Although, it is a serious organization. I understand. My former vis-a-vis in the sense that I served in the first main directorate, Soviet Union's intelligence service. They have always been our opponents. A job is a job. Technically, they did everything right. They achieved their goal of changing the government. However, from political standpoint, it was a colossal mistake. Surely it was political leadership's miscalculation. They should have seen what it would evolve into. So, in 2008, the doors of NATO were opened for Ukraine. In 2014, there was a coup. They started persecuting those who did not accept the coup, and it was indeed a coup. They created a threat to Crimea, which we had to take under our protection. They launched the war in Donbass in 2014 with the use of aircraft and artillery against civilians. This is when it all started. There is a video of aircraft attacking Donetsk from above. They launched a large-scale military operation, then another one.
Okay, so you guys basically get the idea. Like I said, I might skip around a little bit just to avoid copyright and all that. But the point he's making is that the U.S. has repeatedly interfered in the sovereignty of Ukraine, and they're not much different from the Russians, I suppose, in this regard. And that's basically what he's saying. I want to move a little bit to really discussion of the current war itself, because Putin, for a lot of this interview, just spends a long time telling the entire history of all this stuff and all the, and we would react to the full thing, but, I don't want to get us taken down by playing too much at the same time. So here's, let's skip ahead a little bit in this.
What Mr. President Biden responded to me, ask him. At any rate, I talked to him about it.
I'm definitely interested, but from the outside, it seems like this could devolve or evolve into something that brings the entire world into conflict and could initiate a nuclear launch. And so why don't you just call Biden and say, let's work this out?
What's there to work out? It's very simple. I repeat. We have contacts through various agencies. I will tell you what we are saying on this matter and what we are conveying to the US leadership. If you really want to stop fighting, you need to stop supplying weapons. It will be over within a few weeks. That's it. And then we can agree on some terms. Before you do that, stop. What's easier?
And that's common sense if you want a peace deal, but clearly the U.S., at least under Biden, does not want one, right? They want to just continue the war forever. They don't care if every last Ukrainian dies in it. And so that's the truth, is that the U.S. doesn't want peace, and that's the problem. But
why would I call him? What should I talk to him about? Or beg him for what?
And what messages do you get back?
You're going to deliver such and such weapons to Ukraine? Oh, I'm afraid, please don't. What is there to talk about?
Do you think NATO is worried about this becoming a global war or a nuclear conflict?
At least that's what they're talking about. And they're trying to intimidate their own population with an imaginary Russian threat. This is an obvious fact. And thinking people, not Philistines, but thinking people, analysts, those who are engaged in real politics, just smart people, understand perfectly well that this is a fake. They're trying to fuel the Russian threat.
The threat I think you're referring to is a Russian invasion of Poland, Latvia, expansionist behavior. Can you imagine a scenario where you sent Russian troops to Poland?
Only in one case, if Poland attacks Russia. Why? Because we have no interest in Poland, Latvia, or anywhere else. Why would we do that? We simply don't have any interest. It's just threat-mongering.
Well, the argument, I know you know this, is that, well, he invaded Ukraine, he has territorial aims across the continent, and you're saying unequivocally you don't.
It is absolutely out of the question. You just don't have to be any kind of analyst. It goes against common sense to get involved in some kind of a global war. And a global war will bring all humanity to the brink of destruction. It's obvious.
Вот. И есть, конечно, средства.
There are certainly means of deterrence. They have been scaring everyone with us all along. Tomorrow,
Oh, wait. Are you ready for the neocon response? That's exactly what Hitler said, right? Because this is the only thing. They basically operate in this worldview where World War II was the only thing to ever happen in history ever, and Hitler was the only bad guy to ever exist ever, right? So they'll just make this comparison every single time. Everyone around the world is Hitler. Every other world leader who does something, hey, don't you know Hitler did that as well? So, it's hard to convince to the otherwise. In fairness, I don't necessarily buy Putin just saying something to say it, but I also think at the same time, in many ways, yes, it is fear-mongering to say, oh, because they took parts of eastern Ukraine and lost a lot of guys doing it, by the way. It wasn't exactly a total military success on their end. Don't you know this means you're going to have Russian troops in East Berlin by 2025? It's just like, you can make the World War II cliches, but I don't think the issue is quite like that. I don't think everything to ever happen ever is World War II. So anyways, we got a super chat. Andrew Van Halen for 5 says America never left the Cold War. 100% true.
tomorrow Russia will use tactical nuclear weapons. Tomorrow Russia will use that. No, the day after tomorrow. So what?
Выбить из налогоплательщиков
In order to
США
extort additional money from US taxpayers and European taxpayers in the confrontation with Russia in the Ukrainian theater of war.
как можно.
The goal is to weaken Russia as much as possible.
One of our senior United States senators from the state of New York, Chuck Schumer, said yesterday, I believe, that we have to continue to fund the Ukrainian effort, or U.S. soldiers, citizens could wind up fighting there. How do you assess that?
What a thing to say, by the way. If you, the American taxpayer, do not agree to keep funding this war, we're going to draft your children instead. It's an either-or situation, buddy. What a scummy, ridiculous, evil thing to say. Will Chuck Schumer be sending his children? Of course not.
Это провокация.
This is a provocation,
I can't believe
and
he
a
said
cheap
that.
provocation at that.
Американские солдаты должны воевать.
I do not understand why American soldiers should fight in Ukraine. There are mercenaries from the United States there. The bigger number of mercenaries comes from Poland, with mercenaries from the United States in second place and mercenaries from Georgia in third place.
Безусловно.
Well, if somebody has the desire to send regular troops, that would certainly bring humanity to the brink of very serious global conflict. This is obvious. Do the United States need this? What for?
Национальной территории. У вас нечем заниматься.
Thousands of miles away from your national territory.
На границе полно. Проблемы с
Don't you have anything better to do?
с государством.
You have issues on the border, issues with migration, issues with the national debt, more than $33 trillion. You have nothing better to do, so you should fight in Ukraine?
Понимая.
I mean, I know that he is clearly trying to appeal to us, the American conservative, when he says that, but he's not wrong. He's not wrong about that. That's true.
Ситуацию, которая складывается.
Wouldn't it be better to negotiate with Russia? Make an
Yes.
agreement, already understanding the situation that is developing today,
Yes.
realizing that Russia will fight for its interests to the end,
К здравому смыслу.
and realizing
No, they're
this,
gonna win,
actually
guys.
return to common sense, start respecting our country and its interests, and look for certain solutions.
Мне кажется, что это гораздо умнее.
It seems to me that this is much smarter and more rational.
Who blew up Nord Stream?
You for sure.
I was busy that day. Nate, do you have
No, it was Tucker Carlson. I saw him at the bottom of the ocean. I was there too.
I did not blow up
То есть
Nord
у вас-
Stream. Thank you.
But I didn't do
У
it.
вас, у вас лично, может быть, есть алиби. У вас лично.
You personally may have an alibi, but the CIA has no such alibi.
Do you have evidence that NATO or the CIA did it?
Вы знаете, я не
You know, I won't get into details, but people always say in such cases, look for someone who is interested. But in this case, we should not only look for someone who is interested, but also for someone who has capabilities. Because there may be many people interested, but not all of them are capable of sinking to the bottom of the Baltic Sea and carrying out this explosion. These two components should be connected. Who is interested and who is capable of doing it?
But I'm confused. I mean, that's the biggest act of industrial terrorism ever, and it's the largest emission of CO2 in history. Okay, so if you had evidence, and presumably given your security services, your intel services, you would, that NATO, the US, CIA, the West, did this, why wouldn't you present it and win a propaganda victory?
в войне пропаганды очень сложно.
In the war of propaganda, it is very difficult to defeat the United States, because the United States controls all the world's media and many European media. The ultimate beneficiary of the biggest European media are American financial institutions. Don't you know that? So it is possible to get involved in this work, but it is cost prohibitive, so to speak.
Мы можем
We can simply shine the spotlight on our sources of information, and we will not achieve results. It is clear to the whole world what happened, and even American analysts talk about it directly. It's true.
Yes, but here's a question you may be able to answer. You worked in Germany.
So, Putin is trying to imply that it was actually the U.S. who blew up Nord Stream, and there seems to be a lot of evidence in that regard, but he won't really say it directly. Why is that? Frankly, like, I have no idea. I'd love to hear your thoughts on that. I have no idea. Because that, on the flip side, could raise questions, well, then did you do it? Or what really happened there, right? But truthfully, I don't know. Maybe it's a play to keep relations open or negotiations open. I don't know. But you can let me know who you think really blew up Nord Stream. Frankly, it's not an issue I even know a whole lot about. I just know first they said Russia did it. Now they said America did it. I don't know. Decide for yourself.
Germany, famously. The Germans clearly know that their NATO partner did this, but it damaged their economy greatly. It may never recover. Why are they being silent about it? That's very confusing to me. Why wouldn't the Germans say something about it?
Ну, меня это тоже удивляет.
This also confuses me. But today's German leadership is guided by the interests of the collective West rather than its national interests. Otherwise, it is difficult to explain the logic of their action or inaction. After all, it is not only about Nord Stream 1, which was blown up, and the Nord Stream 2 was damaged, but one pipe is safe and sound, and gas can be supplied to Europe through it. But Germany does not open it. We are ready, please. There's another route through Poland, called Yamal Europe, which also allows for large flow. Poland has closed it, but Poland packs from the German hand. It receives money from the pan-European funds, and Germany is the main donor to these pan-European funds. Germany feeds Poland to a certain extent, and they close their route to Germany. Why? I don't understand. Ukraine, to which the Germans supply weapons and give money. Germany is the second sponsor of the United States in terms of financial aid to Ukraine. There are two gas routes through Ukraine. They simply closed one route, the Ukrainians. Open the second route and please get gas from Russia. They do not open it. Why don't the Germans say, look guys, we give you money and weapons, open up the valve, please, let the gas from Russia pass through for us. We're buying liquefied gas at exorbitant prices in Europe, which brings the level of our competitiveness and economy in general down to zero. Do you want us to give you money? Let us have the decent existence. Make money for our economy, because this is where the money we give you comes from. They refuse to do so. Why? Ask them.
Что здесь,
That is what is like in their heads.
знаете,
Those are highly incompetent people.
Well, maybe the world is breaking into two hemispheres, one with cheap energy, the other without. And I want to ask you that. If we're now a multipolar world, obviously we are, can you describe the blocks of alliances? Who is in each side, do you think?
It is interesting why, but I think a point both of them miss there is that the reason Germany is even reliant on Russian energy is because they refuse to produce any of their own, and then they have all those green policies, and all it's done is cause them to need to import it from Russia. So, you know, clearly that wasn't very smart. By the way, that's something Trump called out Angela Merkel about, and obviously little response, but...
Послушайте, вы сказали, мир разделяется на...
Listen, you have said that the world is breaking into two hemispheres. A human brain is divided into two hemispheres.
Одну сферу деятельности, другая более креативная.
One is responsible for one type of activities, the other one is more about creativity and so on. But it is still one and the same head.
Они рассчитаны
The world should be a single whole. Security should be shared rather than meant for the golden billion.
устойчивым и
That is the only scenario where the world could be stable, sustainable, and predictable. Until then, while the head is split in two parts, it is an illness, a serious adverse condition. It is a period of severe disease that the world is going through now.
журналистики, они как
But I think that thanks to honest journalism, this work is akin to work of the doctors. This could somehow be remedied.
Well, let's just give one example, the US dollar, which has kind of united the world in a lot of ways, maybe not to your advantage, but certainly to ours. Is that going away as the reserve currency, the universally accepted currency? How have sanctions, do you think, changed the dollar's place in the world?
Вы знаете, это одна из грубейших
You know,
стратегических
to use the dollar as a tool of foreign policy struggle is one of the biggest strategic mistakes made by the US political leadership.
доллар. Это основа основ могущества США.
The dollar is the cornerstone of the United States power.
Печатать долларов, они
I think everyone understands very well that no matter how many dollars are printed, they are quickly dispersed all over the world.
по-моему, 3% примерно, 3-4, что ли. Вот,
which is kind of shady when you think about it. I don't pretend to understand it or why, but it's weird, you know?
приемлемо для США абсолютно.
Inflation in the United States is minimal. It's about 3 or 3.4%, which is, I think, totally acceptable for the US. But they won't stop printing.
Это
What does the
главное
debt of $33 trillion tell us about?
могущество США.
It is about the emission.
Как только политическое руководство приняло решение использовать доллар в качестве инструмента политической борьбы,
Nevertheless, it is the main weapon used by the United States to preserve its power across the world.
поэтому американцы
As soon as the political leadership decided to use the US dollar as a tool of political struggle, a blow was dealt to this American power.
и огромные
I would not like to use any strong language, but it is a stupid thing to do
даже
and a grave mistake.
сокращаются запасы доллара сейчас. Все смотрят на то, что происходит, и начинают искать возможности.
Look at what is going on in the world.
Но если в отношении
Even the United States allies are now downsizing their dollar reserves. Seeing this, everyone starts looking for ways to protect themselves. But the fact that the United States applies restrictive measures to certain countries, such as placing restrictions on transactions, freezing assets, etc., causes grave concern and sends a signal to the whole world.
в России мы
What did we have here? Until 2022, about 80% of Russian foreign trade transactions were made in US dollars and euros.
в наших расчетах с третьими странами. Значит,
US dollars accounted for approximately 50% of our transactions with third countries.
I'm gonna skip ahead a couple seconds. Here's him relating that whole conversation to China, okay? So take a listen. I believe it's here in the transcript. Okay, yeah, here it is.
Including oil producers are thinking of and already accepting payments for oil in yuan. Do you even realize what is going on or not?
Ну, вы понимаете, что это такое происходит?
Does anyone in the United States realize
Понимает
this?
это в тех же Соединенных Штатах?
What are you doing? You are cutting yourself off. All experts say this.
То, что всегда...
Ask any intelligent and thinking person in the United States what the dollar means for the US.
But
You're killing it with your own hands.
I think that's I think that's a fair assessment. The question is what comes next, and maybe you trade one colonial power for another, much less sentimental and forgiving colonial power. I mean, is the BRICS, for example, in danger of being completely dominated by the Chinese economy in a way that's not good for their sovereignty? Do you worry about that?
And that's a really important question. Frankly, it was the question I was most hoping Tucker would ask of basically anything, which is, I understand fully why Putin is moving towards the arms of China, right? Because he's isolated from everyone else. As I've been bringing up repeatedly, that was a big strategic error of the United States, is putting them in that position. But, you know, candidly, I don't think the Russians can trust the Chinese any more than the US can trust the Chinese. And deep down, part of me thinks they really don't. And that's why Russia has not immediately ran into China's hands. It's been kind of a slow, uneasy relationship at best. Contrary to what people say, they are actually not natural allies. That is not true. Even during the Soviet days, Russia and China still weren't getting along back then. They see each other as many ways, you know, as competitors. Putin says something to the contrary. It's rhetorical. I think he really probably distrusts China a little bit more than this, but let's hear his response to it.
Well, we have heard those boogeyman stories before. It is a boogeyman story. We're neighbors with China. You cannot choose neighbors just as you cannot choose close relatives. We share a border of 1,000 kilometers with them. This is number one. Second, we have a centuries-long history of coexistence. We're used to it.
Again, that's not really true. Okay? I will say I disagree with Putin on that. That's not really true. And again, I understand why he's forced in this situation to go into their hands, but ask the United States that entering an alliance or open trade with China is not a good idea. And this is why partially Vivek has brought this up on the campaign trail, is we need to do everything we can to stop that partnership. And that if that means kind of pulling the lesser of the two evils away, which I think is Russia, I think that's very smart. But here's what he has to say about China.
Third, China's foreign policy philosophy is not aggressive. Its idea is to always look for compromise, and we can see that.
See, true, but I think compromise, that's always shady. That he is right. Like they don't go invading places. They more so like subvert your economy, you know? But
the next point is as follows. We're always told the same boogeyman story, and here it goes again. Through an euphemistic form, but it is still the same boogeyman story. The cooperation with China keeps increasing. The pace at which China's cooperation with Europe is growing is higher and greater than that of the growth of Chinese-Russian cooperation. Ask Europeans, aren't they afraid? They might be, I don't know. But they are still trying to access China's market at all costs, especially now that they are facing economic problems. Chinese businesses are also exploring the European market. Do Chinese businesses have small presence in the United States? Yes, the political decisions are such that they are trying to limit their cooperation with China. It is to your own detriment, Mr. Tucker, that you are limiting cooperation with China. You are hurting yourself. It is a delicate matter, and there are no silver bullet solutions, just as it is with the dollar. So, before introducing any illegitimate sanctions, illegitimate in terms of the Charter of the United Nations, one should think very carefully. For decision makers, this appears to be a problem.
So you said a moment ago that the world would be a lot better if it weren't broken into competing alliances, if there was cooperation globally. One of the reasons you don't have that is because the current American administration is dead set against you. Do you think if there were a new administration after Joe Biden that you would be able to reestablish communication with the US government? Or does it not matter who the president is?
Сейчас скажу, но чтобы закончить предыдущий вопрос.
I will
It should be a priority of conservatives to, again, be trying to break up the Russia-China alliance, like 100%. That's a no-brainer. That's a no-brainer. But instead, for some reason, we are dead set on strengthening it, and then calling people pro-Putin if they try to ask questions like, why are we doing this and how is that smart? Anyway, super chat really quickly. Savage Beaver, I should say, for 30 NT says, support you from Taiwan, aka the real China. Well, thank you, Savage Beaver. I appreciate that very much.
tell you. But let me finish the previous thought. We, together with my colleague and friend, President Xi Jinping, set a goal to reach $200 billion of mutual trade with China this year. We have exceeded this level. According to our figures, our bilateral trade with China totals already $230 billion. And the
P7 2017 says, wow, I only got here a minute ago, but it sounds a whole lot like Putin is working with China. Well, he is. That's a very openly known fact. The point I'm making, and when you hear it in terms of what he was saying before, is that he's either going to work with the West or work with China. He tried to work with the West a lot, and we shot him down. And now what's happening? He's going to China, because where else does he have to go? The West has sanctioned him into oblivion. There's no one else behind him besides China. And again, the point I've always made is that if you're going to isolate anyone, you want to isolate China. And the best way to isolate China is by having Russia at least neutral instead of right in their arms, right?
Chinese statistics says it is $240 billion. One more important thing, our trade is well balanced, mutually complementary in high-tech, energy, scientific research and development. It is very balanced. As for BRICS, where Russia took over the presidency this year, the BRICS countries are, by and large, developing very rapidly. Look, if memory serves me right, back in 1992, the share of the G7 countries in the world economy amounted to 47%, whereas in 2022 it was down to, I think, a little over 30%. The BRICS countries accounted for only 16% in 1992, but now their share is greater than that of the G7. It has nothing to do with the events in Ukraine. This is due to the trends of global development and world economy, as I mentioned just now. And this is inevitable. This will keep happening. It is like the rise of the sun. You cannot prevent the sun from rising. You have to adapt to it. How do the United States adapt? With the help of force, sanctions, pressure, bombings, and use of armed forces. This is about self-conceit. Your political establishment does not understand that the world is changing under objective circumstances. And in order to preserve your level, even if someone aspires, pardon me, to the level of dominance, you have to make the right decisions in a competent and timely manner. Such brutal actions, including with regard to Russia and, say, other countries, are counterproductive. This is an obvious fact. It has already become evident. You just asked me if another leader comes and changes something. It is not about the leader. It is not about the personality of a particular person. I had a very good relationship with, say, Bush. I know that in the United States, he was portrayed as some kind of a country boy who does not understand much. I assure you that this is not the case.
You know, it's interesting when I hear Putin talk, and clearly he is very sharp, like, agree or not, he knows what he's talking about. is if I were to really break down his sort of world philosophy, to me it seems like ruthless utilitarianism, right? I think he's a pragmatist all the way to his core. Now, obviously, the people who don't like him will bring up the fact that perhaps, and I don't deny this at all, sometimes that translates perhaps into brutality, right? Obviously, right? That's what happens when you're totally utilitarian and you have no care for anything else. However, I think on the flip side, you kind of notice that seems to be all he really is about. Like, he's not, I think he is an ideological man, but he's not a guy who's so deeply tied to one certain principle or another that he lets it get in the way, right? He just looks at it like, what's best for my government and what's best for Russia, okay? So he's going to go, first he tries to go to the West because he thinks that's best for Russia. The West says no. He doesn't complain about it too much. He's more like, okay, it is what it is. Let's go to this other guy. Okay, they're totally pushing us out. Let's go to China then. We were isolated from China before, but this is what it is. And, you know, I think, though, on the flip side, that proves the point I'm trying to make here, which is I think we need to try to pull Russia away from China. I think if you present something in terms of a deal that is also within Putin's own self-interest as well as the American interest, because I think America does have an interest in breaking up the Russo-Chinese alliance. I think that's arguably one of the most important things we need to do. I think if you present something to Putin that would benefit him, listening to the way he talks, I think he would totally take it. Because that's all he's really about, right? He's not about aligning with China or the West. He's a ruthless pragmatist. That's really the way I see him, a ruthless pragmatist for his own country, right? And so that can be scary sometimes, but it also means that I don't think he's unreachable. I think you can work with him to, again, break the alliance with China, which I think is most important.
I think he made a lot of mistakes with regard to Russia, too. I told you about 2008 and the decision in Bucharest to open the NATO's doors for Ukraine and so on. That happened during his presidency. He actually exercised pressure on the Europeans. But in general, on a personal human level, I had a very good relationship with him. He was no worse than any other American or Russian or European politician. I assure you, he understood what he was doing as well as others. I had such personal relationship with Trump as well. It is not about the personality of the leader. It is about the elite's mindset.
P7 says, don't know, Vince. Yes, he wants something for Russia, but there is also a lot of the old school Soviet expander in there. But I think that also proves my point, because Putin kind of plays both sides literally all the time. Because on one hand, he'll celebrate Victory Day and kind of like appeal to the Soviet Union. And then on the other hand, he will appear more to like the old Russian Empire and the Tsar and Orthodox Christianity and all that stuff. He's a very fluid sort of guy. And to me, it's all about him just trying to do his best pragmatic job to keep his own power and keep his own authority, right? So that's another thing I find interesting about Putin, which is like sometimes he'll praise the Soviet Union, and then sometimes he'll praise the Russian Empire and the monarchy before it, and those things are totally opposed. But whatever kind of gives credibility, I guess, to his authority, that seems to be the only thing when I read him that he really cares about. So, I mean, he's an interesting figure to study, I would say, to say the least.
If the idea of domination at any cost, based also on forceful actions, dominates the American society, nothing will change. It will only get worse. But if, in the end, one comes to the awareness that the world has been changing due to the objective circumstances, and that one should be able to adapt to them in time, using the advantages that the US still has today, then perhaps something may change. Look, China's economy has become the first economy in the world in purchasing power parity. In terms of volume, it overtook the US a long time ago. The USA comes second, then India, 1.5 billion people, and then Japan, with Russia in the 5th place. Russia was the first economy in Europe last year, despite all the sanctions and restrictions. Is it normal from your point of view? Sanctions, restrictions, impossibility of payments in dollars, being cut off from SWIFT services, sanctions against our ships carrying oil, sanctions against airplanes, sanctions in everything, everywhere. The largest number of sanctions in the world which are applied against Russia. And we have become Europe's first economy during this time. The tools that US uses don't work. Well, one has to think about what to do. If this realization comes to the ruling elites, then yes, then the first person of the state will act in anticipation of what the voters and the people who make decisions at various levels expect from this person. Then maybe something will change.
But you're describing two different the Munich Security Conference and encouraged the president of Ukraine to join NATO. Do you think that was an effort to provoke you into military action?
I repeat once again, we have repeatedly proposed to seek a solution to the problems that arose in Ukraine after 2014.
It's all your fault, Putin!
Peaceful means. But no one listened to us. And moreover, the Ukrainian leaders who were under the complete US control suddenly declared that they would not comply with the Minsk agreements. They disliked everything there and continued military activity in that territory. And in parallel, that territory was being exploited by NATO military structures under the guise of various personnel training and retraining centers. They essentially began to create bases there. That's all. Ukraine announced that the Russians were a non-titular nationality, while passing the laws that limit the rights of non-titular nationalities in Ukraine. Ukraine, having received all these southeastern territories as a gift from the Russian people, suddenly announced that the Russians were a non-titular nationality in that territory.
No, it wasn't water. I wish it was water. It was freaking energy drink. It's a sugar. Ugh. This is gonna be bad.
Is that normal? All this put together led to the decision to end the war that neo-Nazis started in Ukraine in 2014.
Do you think Zelensky has the freedom to negotiate a settlement to this conflict?
I'll answer that. No, because the West has openly told him not to. Boris Johnson, early 2022, literally went to Zelensky and said, don't do it. So that's the answer, but...
I don't know the details. Of course, it's difficult for me to judge. But I believe he has, in any case, he used to have. His father fought against the fascists, Nazis, during World War II. I once talked to him about this. I said, Volodya, what are you doing? Why are you supporting neo-Nazis in Ukraine today, while your father fought against fascism? He was a front-line soldier. I will not tell you what he answered. This is a separate topic, and I think it's incorrect for me to do so. But as to the freedom of choice,
everyone's
why
making
not?
fun of me in
He
chat.
came to power on the expectations of Ukrainian people that he would lead Ukraine
It's
to
Putin's
peace.
fault.
He talked about this. It was thanks to this that he won the elections overwhelmingly. But then, when he came to power, in my opinion, he realized two things. Firstly, it is better not to clash with neo-Nazis and nationalists, because they are aggressive and very active. You can expect anything from them. And secondly, the US-led West supports them and will always support those who antagonize with Russia. It is beneficial and safe. So he took the relevant position despite promising his people to end the war in Ukraine. He deceived.
And that's true. RFK talks about this, right? The Minsk, yeah, I think so. Accords were on the table, and okay, now I cut myself. I not only did I spill the drink, I cut myself with the can. Very nice. Okay. They were on the table. Zelensky actually got elected off of promising that he would sign them. And then what happened? The West told him no. Biden, Boris Johnson told him no. And now we are where we are, and I cut my finger. Thanks, Ukraine.
His voters.
But do you think at this point, as of February 2024, he has the latitude, the freedom to speak with you or your government directly about putting an end to this, which clearly isn't helping his
one of those
country
like skin cuts
or the world? Can he do that, do you think?
Ну, а почему нет?
I need to get a bandage.
Why not? He considers himself head of state. He won the elections. Although we believe in Russia that the coup d'etat is the primary source of power for everything that happened after 2014. And in this sense, even today, government is flawed. But he considers himself the president, and he is recognized by the United States, all of Europe, and practically the rest of the world in such a capacity. Why not? He can. We negotiated with Ukraine in Istanbul. We agreed. He was aware of this. Moreover, the negotiation group leader, Mr. Arahamiya is his last name, I believe still heads the faction of the ruling party, the party of the president in the Rada. He still heads the presidential faction in the Rada, the country's parliament. He still sits there. He even put his preliminary signature on the document I am telling you about. But then he publicly stated to the whole world, we were ready to sign this document, but Mr. Johnson, then the Prime Minister of Great Britain, came and dissuaded us from doing this, saying it was better to fight Russia.
And that's true. That's not Putin's side of the story, whatever, that's true. We've talked about this actually on this channel long before this interview.
They would give everything needed for us to return what was lost during the clashes with Russia. And we agreed with this proposal. Look, his statement has been published. He said it publicly.
Yeah.
Can they return to this or not? The question is, do they want it or not? Further on, President of Ukraine issued a decree prohibiting negotiations with us. Let him cancel that decree, and that's it. We have never refused negotiations, indeed. We hear all the time, is Russia ready? Yes, we have not refused. It was them who publicly refused. Well, let him cancel his decree and enter into negotiations. We have never refused.
Okay, well, let me ask the question then to the people on the other side of this. What was and is the rationale, especially, we're talking about the start of this war, of telling Ukraine, by the way, this is about their democracy and their sovereignty, and they're not even allowed to decide. Instead, the West is going to come in and tell Ukraine what to do. Just going to say that. But what has been the practical benefit of that? Why has that been a good thing? That you dragged on this war and you basically sent a huge portion of the fighting age men in Ukraine to die? What for? What for? To retake Crimea? That's never going to happen. Right? Because that's what some people are saying. Pre-2014 borders. That's totally unrealistic. So, what's the rationale there? What has this done? Okay? You could maybe make the argument that it has drained Russia's military resources. Okay, maybe that's an argument. But does that outweigh the cost of all the money we've sent over there? Of all the everything? Like, what exactly has been the point? I wonder what people would say.
And the fact that
of telling
they
Ukraine
the
they can't negotiate for peace.
Persuasion of Mr. Johnson, the former Prime Minister of Great Britain, seems ridiculous and very sad to me. Because, as Mr. Arahamiya put it, we could have stopped those hostilities with war a year and a half ago already. But the British persuaded us and we refused this. Where is Mr. Johnson now? And the war continues.
That's a good question. Where do you think?
But let me ask this question too. This is not Putin's side of the story. This is a known fact. Like he said, Boris Johnson has admitted this. Why is that never talked about? Why does the media never tell you that Russia and Ukraine had a peace deal on the table ready to sign, and it was the US and UK who stepped in, told Ukraine to keep fighting, and, you know, basically told them what to do, and now a bunch of Ukrainians are dead because of it? Why did they never mention that? Wouldn't that be a pretty relevant part to the story of why this war is continuing on? Why did they want to shut down this interview so much and not let you see it? Right?
I think he is, and why did he do that?
Right?
Да хрен его знает, о чем это, я не понимаю. Общая
Hell
установка была.
knows.
Почему-то
I don't
всё
understand it
сложилось именно,
myself.
что Россию можно победить на поле.
There was a general starting point. For some reason, everyone had the illusion that Russia could be defeated on the battlefield.
От чистого сердца, но
Because of arrogance, because of a pure heart, but not because of a great mind.
You've described the connection between Russia and Ukraine. You've described Russia itself a couple of times as Orthodox. That's central to your understanding of Russia. You've said you're Orthodox. What does that mean for you? You're a Christian leader by your own description. So what effect does that have on you?
You know, as I already mentioned, in 988, Prince Vladimir himself was baptized following the example of his grandmother, Princess Olga. And then he baptized his squad. And then, gradually, over the course of several years, he baptized all the Rus. It was a lengthy process, from pagans to Christians. It took many years. But in the end, this orthodoxy, Eastern Christianity, deeply rooted itself in the consciousness of the Russian people.
когда Россия расширялась,
When Russia expanded and absorbed other nations who profess Islam, Buddhism, and Judaism, Russia has always been very loyal to those people who profess other religions. This is her strength. This is absolutely clear. And the fact is that the main postulates, main values are very similar, not to say the same, in all world religions I've just mentioned, and which are the traditional religions of the Russian Federation, Russia. By the way, Russian authorities were always very careful about the culture and religion of those people who came into the Russian Empire. This, in my opinion, forms the basis of both security and stability of the Russian statehood. All the peoples inhabiting Russia basically consider it their motherhood. If, say, people move over to you or to Europe from Latin America, an even clearer and more understandable example, people come, but yet they have come to you or to European countries from their historical homeland. And people who profess different religions in Russia consider Russia their motherland. They have no other motherland. We are together. This is one big family, and our traditional values are very similar. I've just mentioned one big family, but everyone has his, her own family. And this is the basis of our society. And if we say that the motherland and the family are specifically connected with each other, it is indeed the case, since it is impossible to ensure a normal future for our children and our families unless we ensure a normal, sustainable future for the entire country, for the motherland. That is why patriotic sentiment is so strong in Russia.
But can I
I think, by the way, that's another example of what I brought up earlier, that when I read into Vladimir Putin, all I see is a very ruthless pragmatist, right? Because on one hand, he'll play the Orthodox Christian card, and he does that a lot, but he's also not this super right-wing, theocratic, conservative dictator or monarch or whatever, but he'll play into that sometimes when it's kind of for the unity of the Russian state or the credibility of his leadership to appeal to the old Russia or whatever. But then at other points, he'll kind of praise the Soviet Union and then say the Soviet, because also a lot of Russians actually, believe it or not, feel a nostalgia for the Soviet Union because the post-Soviet era has been such a mess in that country. And in some ways, I don't entirely blame them. I understand why they feel that way. So I think that's just another example of it. I don't know. I don't know what you guys think.
See, the one way in which the religions are different is that Christianity is specifically a nonviolent religion. Jesus says, turn the other cheek, don't kill. How can a leader who has to kill, of any country, how can a leader be a Christian? How do you reconcile that to yourself?
By the way, for people who said this interview was propaganda, please find me one example of a Western journalist asking Zelensky a question that difficult, okay? Just please find me that.
Очень легко. Если речь идет о защите себя и своей семьи.
It is very easy when it comes to protecting oneself and one's family, one's homeland. We won't attack anyone.
С госпереворота и с начала боевых действий на Донецке.
When did the developments in Ukraine start?
На Донбассе. Вот с чего.
Since the coup d'etat and the hostilities in Donbass began, that's when they started. And we're protecting our people, ourselves, our homeland, and our future.
Она не во внешних проявлениях, и в том, чтобы ходить
As for religion in general,
или бить головой в пол. Она в сердце.
you know, it's not about external manifestations. It's not about going to church every day or banging your head on the floor.
Человекоориентированная. И
It is in the heart. And our culture is so human-oriented.
гений.
Dostoevsky, who was very well known in the West and the genius of Russian culture, Russian literature, spoke a lot about this, about the Russian soul.
Русский человек, российский человек, он думает больше о вечном, он думает больше о ценностях.
After all, Western society is more pragmatic. Russian people think more about the eternal, about moral values. I don't know, maybe you won't agree with me, but Western culture is more pragmatic after all.
Возможность вот сегодняшнему этому золотому миллиарду.
I'm not saying this is bad. It makes it possible for today's golden billion to achieve good success in production, even in science and so on.
Что мы вроде как выглядим одинаково, но
There's nothing wrong with that. I'm just saying that we kind of look the same, but our minds are built.
I don't think our Western society is pragmatic as much as I would argue like Chinese society is pragmatic, right? It's all about you do what, okay? You never. I think Western society is very individualistic. And there's a component of that which is good. I would argue it's the reason why like European civilizations historically are responsible for most of the technological innovation because they're creative, they think for themselves. That's good. But I think that modern Western society has become overly individualistic to the point where we forsake all personal responsibility to anything else. To country, to family, to community, to God, you know, all of that stuff, right? So this is the sort of me generation, or the, you know, like, you're entitled to everything, or, you know, no one looks after their family, and divorce and all that stuff. Like, I would argue it's not pragmatic. It's a random thought. I don't know how it's related, but it's just a comment I have. It's not ruthless pragmatism that's dooming the West. And I don't even think it's truly a Western characteristic. It's more of an Asian characteristic, I would say. I think it's actually too much individualism, right? Now, criticism I would have of Asian culture, as an Asian myself, is that I don't think there's enough individualism in Asian culture, right? In the sense that there is such a drive for conformity and, okay, you be doctor, you do that, that a lot of times I noticed this, and I was sort of raised by Americanized parents, I guess you could say, so this wasn't so much true for me, but a lot of Asians struggle in terms of creativity and thinking for themselves, etc. And you sort of see this in the modern day with the world order, right? Why do you think China can never innovate technology for themselves, for the most part, but they're really good at copying what America does and stealing American technology? It's because a lot of Asian cultures lack creativity. That's a totally side tangent. I don't know. I just think it's interesting. Who cares?
See the supernatural at work as you look out across what's happening in the world now? Do you see God at work? Do you ever think to yourself, these are forces that are not human?
Да нет, я, честно говоря, так не думаю. Я думаю о том, что
No, to be honest, I don't
мировое
think
сообщество
so.
развивается вот по своим внутренним
My
законам.
opinion is that the development of the world community is in accordance with the inherent laws, and those laws are what they are.
Так было всегда в истории человечества.
It's always been this way in the history of mankind.
Занимались,
Some
размножались,
nations and countries rose, became stronger and more numerous, and then left the international stage, losing the status they had accustomed to.
наверное, не нужно приводить эти примеры, но начиная
There's probably no need for me to give examples, but we could start with the Genghis Khan and horde conquerors, the Golden Horde, and then end with the Roman Empire.
человечество каждый
It seems that there has never been anything like the Roman Empire in the history of mankind.
потенциал варваров постепенно накапливался.
Nevertheless, the potential of the barbarians gradually grew, as did their population. In general, the barbarians were getting stronger and begun to develop economically, as we would say today.
Экономически они стали укрепляться.
This eventually led to the collapse of the Roman Empire and the regime imposed by the Romans.
500 лет. Этот процесс,
However, it took 5 centuries for the Roman Empire to fall apart.
в сегодняшней ситуации
The
разница
difference with what is happening now
процессы изменений
is that all the processes of change are happening at a much faster pace than in Roman times.
So when does the AI empire start, do you think?
у меня все в более
You're
сложные
asking increasingly more complicated questions. To answer them, you need to be an expert in big
Для того,
numbers,
чтобы
big
ответить,
data,
надо быть,
and
конечно,
AI.
специалистом в
Mankind is
сфере
currently
очень
facing many threats. Due to the genetic researches, it is now possible to create a superhuman, a specialized human being, a genetically engineered athlete, scientist, military man. There are reports that Elon Musk had already had a chip implanted in the human brain in the USA.
Илон Маск внедрил уже чип в мозг какого-то человека.
What do you think of that?
Ну, Маска, я думаю, что Маска остановить
Well,
невозможно.
I think there's no stopping Elon Musk. He will do as he sees fit.
Надо искать
Nevertheless,
способы
you need to find some common ground with him, search for ways to persuade him. I think he's a smart person, I truly believe he is. So you need to reach an agreement with him because this process needs to be formalized and subjected to certain rules.
Того, что будет происходить.
Uncontrolled
Okay, I'm skipping ahead like 60 seconds here, but all right, here's another interesting part of this interview. Tucker Carlson asks him about Evan Gershkovich, I think his name is, which is an imprisoned American journalist in Russia. And it's funny because I saw a lot of people who were criticizing Tucker for this interview say, I bet he won't ask about that journalist kid. And then Tucker just literally went and asked about it, which I will admit takes a lot of guts. Again, it's never something one of these other journalists would do with Zelensky. Have they asked about the many journalists, I'm sure some of them American, who have been imprisoned by Zelensky? No, absolutely not. But here's that exchange.
development of AI or genetics or any other field, the time will come to reach an international agreement on how to regulate these things.
I appreciate all the time you've given us. I just got to ask you one last question, and that's about someone who's very famous in the United States, probably not here, Evan Gershkovich, who's the Wall Street Journal reporter. He's 32, and he's been in prison for almost a year. This is a huge story in the United States, and I just want to ask you directly, without getting into the details of it or your version of what happened, if as a sign of your decency, you would be willing to release him to us and we'll bring him back to the United States.
Мы столько сделали жестов доброй воли, что, мне кажется, мы исчерпали все линии.
We have done so many gestures of goodwill out of decency that I think we have run out of them.
Ни разу не ответил. Но
We have never seen anyone reciprocate to us in a similar manner.
что мы
However, in theory, we can say that we do not rule out that we can do
не
that
исключаем того, что мы можем это
if our
сделать
partners
при
take reciprocal steps.
встречном движении со стороны наших
When I talk about the partners, I first of all refer to special services.
представителей специальных служб.
Special services are in contact with one another. They are talking about the matter in question. There is no taboo to settle this issue. We are willing to solve it. But there are certain terms being discussed via special services channels. I believe an agreement can be reached.
You know, I think the truth about that is, I'm sure eventually, you know, they'll do a prisoner exchange. But notice this kid versus Brittany Griner. Remember her? If you really ask me, if I were really to speculate on this, I think the difference between them and why Biden doesn't even appear to be trying very hard to set up some type of prisoner exchange is, I mean, let's just put it very bluntly here, right? Brittany Griner is a lesbian, black WNBA player. It's like, oh yeah, divert, right? We know how the hierarchy of this whole thing goes. Whereas this kid, this journalist, Gershkovich, whatever his name is, he's a white guy. How much was that the component of it? How much of Brittany Griner was the PR aspect? And that's why they tried, and this kid, they're not really trying? I gotta say, you have to speculate that probably has at least a little something to do with it, you know?
So typically, I mean, this stuff has happened for obviously centuries. One country catches another spy within its borders, it trades it for one of its own intel guys in another country. I think what makes, and it's not my business, but what makes this different is the guy's obviously not a spy, he's a kid. And maybe he was breaking your law in some way, but he's not a super spy, and everybody knows that. And he's being held hostage in exchange, which is true. With respect, it's true, and everyone knows it's true. So maybe he's in a different category. Maybe it's not fair to ask for, you know, somebody else in exchange for letting him out. Maybe it degrades Russia to do that.
Вы знаете, можно как угодно говорить, что такое шпион, что не шпион.
You know, you can give different interpretations to what constitutes a spy, but there are certain things provided by law. If a person gets secret information and does that in conspiratorial manner, then this is qualified as espionage. And that is exactly what he was doing. He was receiving classified, confidential information, and he did it covertly. Maybe he did that out of carelessness or his own initiative. Considering the sheer fact this is qualified as espionage, the fact has been proven as he was caught red-handed when he was receiving this information. If it had been some far-fetched excuse, some fabrication, something not proven, it would have been a different story then. But he was caught red-handed when he was secretly getting confidential information. What is it then?
But are you suggesting that he was working for the US government or NATO, or he was just a reporter who was given material he wasn't supposed to have? Those seem like very different things.
Я не знаю, на кого он работал. Но повторяю еще раз.
I don't know who he was working for, but I would like to reiterate that getting classified information in secret is called espionage, and he was working for the US Special Services, some other agencies. I don't think he was working for Monaco, as Monaco is hardly interested in getting that information. It is up to special services to come to an agreement. Some groundwork has been laid. There are people who, in our view, are not connected with special services. Let me tell you a story about a person serving a sentence in an allied country of the US. That person, due to patriotic sentiments, eliminated a bandit in one of the European capitals. During the events in the Caucasus, do you know what he was doing?
So look, espionage or not, I don't know. I mean, really no one is ever going to know the truth on that. The American government should be doing everything they can to bring him home. He's still an American citizen. You know, it is what it is. But again, I bring up the question, how hard do you think they're really trying? Because Brittany Griner, you know, they were on the fay. Get her home, you know? This guy, you know, I'll make a prediction. I think if Trump wins and he gets into office, you'd be surprised. I think that guy's going to come home pretty fast, is what I'll say about that.
I don't want to say that, but I will do it anyway. He was laying our soldiers, taken prisoner, on the road and then drove his car over their heads. What kind of person is that? Can he even be called human? But there was a patriot who eliminated him in one of the European capitals. Whether he did it of his own volition or not, that is a different question.
Yeah, but Evan Gershkovich didn't do that. I mean, that's a completely different. I mean, this is a 32-year-old newspaper reporter.
He committed something different. He's not just a journalist. I reiterate, he's a journalist who was secretly getting confidential information. Yes, it is different, but still, I'm talking about other people who are essentially controlled by the US authorities, wherever they are serving a sentence. There is an ongoing dialogue between the special services. This has to be resolved in a calm, responsible, and professional manner. They are keeping in touch, so let them do their work. I do not rule out that the person you refer to, Mr. Gershkovich, may return to his motherland. By the end of the day, it does not make any sense to keep him in prison in Russia. We want the US Special Services to think about how they can contribute to achieving the goals our special services are pursuing. We are ready to talk. Moreover, the talks are underway. And there have been many successful examples of these talks crowned with success. Probably this is going to be crowned with success as well. But we have to come to an agreement.
And again, I reiterate, I don't think Biden is trying, basically at all. By the way, look at this. Nevada, we've had it for how long now? They still only have 1% of their votes in. Chat, what's going on in Nevada? It's actually typical. That's how all the West Coast states count their votes. It's an atrocity, okay? It's been at 1% for like an hour. The polls closed at 10:30. It's 11:52. Unbelievable. Yeah, anyways, just going to point that out.
Mr. President, thank you.
I also want him to return to his homeland at last. I'm absolutely sincere. But let me say once again, the dialogue continues. The more public we render things of this nature, the more difficult it becomes to resolve them. Everything has to be done in calm manner.
I wonder if that's true with the war, though, also. I mean, I guess I want to ask one more question, which is, and maybe you don't want to say so for strategic reasons, but are you worried that what's happening in Ukraine could lead to something much larger and much more horrible? And how motivated are you just to call the US government and say, let's come to terms?
I already said that we did not refuse to talk. We are willing to negotiate. It is the Western side, and Ukraine is obviously a satellite state of the US. It is evident. I do not want you to take it as if I'm looking for a strong word or an insult, but we both understand what is happening. The financial support, $72 billion was provided. Germany ranks second, then other European countries come. Dozens of billions of US dollars are going to Ukraine. There's a huge influx of weapons. In this case, you should tell the current Ukrainian leadership to stop and come to a negotiating table, rescind this absurd decree. We did not refuse.
Sure, but you already said it. I didn't think you meant it as an insult, because you already said correctly, it's been reported that Ukraine was prevented from negotiating a peace settlement by the former British Prime Minister, acting on behalf of the Biden administration. So, of course, they're a satellite. Big countries control small countries. That's not new. And that's why I asked about dealing directly with the Biden administration, which is making these decisions, not President Zelensky of Ukraine.
Но если администрация Зеленского на Украине отказалась от переговоров
Well, if the Zelensky administration in Ukraine refused to negotiate, I assume they did it under the instruction from Washington. If Washington believes it to be the wrong decision, let it abandon it. Let it find a delicate excuse so that no one is insulted. Let it come up with a way out. It was not us who made this decision, it was them. So let them go back on it. That is it. However, they made the wrong decision, and now we have to look for a way out of the situation to correct their mistakes. They did it, so let them correct it themselves. We support this.
So I just want to make sure I'm not misunderstanding what you're saying. I don't think that I am. I think you're saying you want a negotiated settlement to what's happening in Ukraine.
Don't let them hear that one.
Right. And we made it. We prepared a huge document in Istanbul that was initialed by the head of the Ukrainian delegation.
And again, that's true. Ukraine wanted one too. It was the US and UK who stopped it. And then we tell ourselves, you're going to abandon the Ukrainians? Their right to self-determination. Yeah, no, it's not about that. You want to be honest and say it's about keeping them a proxy state, maybe I would respect that more. But at least be honest with me. Don't lie to me or insult my intelligence, pretending like that's what this is about, because it's not.
He fixed his signature to some of the provisions, not to all of it. He put his signature and then he himself said, we were ready to sign it and the war would have been over long ago, 18 months ago. However, Prime Minister Johnson came, talked us out of it, and we missed that chance. Well, you missed it, you made a mistake. Let them get back to that, that is all. Why do we have to bother ourselves and correct somebody else's mistakes? I know one can say it is our mistake. It was us who intensified the situation and decided to put an end to the war that started in 2014 in Donbass, as I have already said, by means of weapons. Let me get back to further in history. I already told you this. We were just discussing it. Let us go back to 1991, when we were promised that NATO would not expand, to 2008, when the doors to NATO opened to the declaration of state sovereignty of Ukraine, declaring Ukraine a neutral state. Let us go back to the fact that NATO and US military bases started to appear on the territory of Ukraine, creating threats to us. Let us go back to coup d'etat in Ukraine in 2014. It is pointless though, isn't it? We may go back and forth endlessly, but they stopped negotiations. Is it a mistake? Yes. Correct it. We are ready. What else is needed?
Do you think it's too humiliating at this point for NATO to accept Russian control of what was 2 years ago Ukrainian territory?
Yes.
I said let them think how to do it with dignity. There are options if there is a will. Up until now, there has been the uproar and screaming about inflicting a strategic defeat on Russia on the battlefield. Now they are apparently coming to realize that it is difficult to achieve, if possible at all. In my opinion, it is impossible by definition. It is never going to happen. It seems to me that now, those who are in power in the West have come to realize this as well. If so, if the realization has set in, they have to think what to do next. We are ready for this dialogue.
Would you be willing to say, congratulations, NATO, you won, and just keep the situation where it is now?
You know, it is a subject matter for the negotiations. No one is willing to conduct, or, to put it more accurately, they are willing, but do not know how to do it. I know they want to. It is not just I see it, but I know they do want it. But they are struggling to understand how to do it. They have driven the situation to the point where we are at. It is not us who have done that. It is our partners, opponents who have done that. Well, now let them think how to reverse the situation. We're not against it. It would be funny if it were not so sad.
Да, было бы смешно, если бы не было так грустно.
This endless mobilization in Ukraine, the hysteria, the domestic problems, sooner or later it will result in agreement.
Истерика там, внутренние проблемы.
For the record, I've said that for, 2 years now? Dude, time flies, man. Let's everyone be realistic about this, which is something neocons can never do. All they chase is ideals and vague platitudes. They never want to be honest about anything. How's the war going to end realistically between Russia and Ukraine? Like, seriously, how do you think it's going to end? Let's be real. Everyone knows it. The outcome has been obvious to me for years at this point. Is Ukraine, to their own credit, they did enough to ward off Russia in terms of taking the whole country. They're not going to, take all of Ukraine. But clearly they're going to walk away with some territorial gains, being Russia. And in the end, Ukraine will not be able to stop it. And in the end, Russia certainly is not giving up Crimea. And that's the situation we're currently at. So, do we reach that settlement now? Or do we let Ukrainians keep dying for 5 years and then do it then? Right? So that is true. The inevitability of what's going to happen, that's something I've said for a long time. But don't tell the neocons that. No, you want to hand over all of Ukraine to Putin? It's literally a straw man position of what I'm saying. But what exactly do you want to do then? Your alternative. Is it that every last Ukrainian man, woman, and child should fight to the very end, sacrifice all their lives, and just make Ukraine a wasteland? Would that satisfy you? Like, what exactly is your goal with all of this? Right? What is your goal with all of this? Because I'd argue the longer this war goes, the more Russian manpower and, they're going to get more and more competent is just going to overrun Ukraine. So what's the end game here? They have no end game. You ask Biden, listen to what Biden says about this. He has no idea. He says, it's going to stop when Putin stops being bad. That's a very not so loose paraphrasing of what he actually said about it. They don't have anything, right? But how dare we say, why don't you... And I like Vivek Ramaswamy's idea a lot. You do a settlement where you freeze the lines of control, and at the same time, in order to do that, you break the Russia-China alliance. That's perfect in my opinion. That gives Russia something they want. Like I said, I think Putin is a ruthless pragmatist at the end of the day. And it gives America something that's very important to us, which is we, by no means, at all costs, should want to prevent the Russia-China alliance. But you want to hand over Ukraine! What about Zelensky? What about all the taxpayer money that we keep laundering over there? How would Zelensky buy another mansion? It's just like you can't have a rational discussion with the reasonable discussion, like Cenk Uyghur would say. You literally can't have one with these people. All they do is call you names.
This probably sounds strange given the current situation. But the relations between the two peoples will be rebuilt anyway. It will take a lot of time, but they will heal. I'll give you very unusual examples. There is a combat encounter on the battlefield. Here's a specific example. Ukrainian soldiers got encircled. This is an example from real life. Our soldiers were shouting to them, "There is no chance. Surrender yourselves. Come out and you will be alive." Suddenly, the Ukrainian soldiers were screaming from there in Russian, perfect Russian, saying, "Russians, do not surrender." And all of them perished. They still identify themselves as Russian. What is happening is, to a certain extent, an element of a civil war. Everyone in the West thinks that the Russian people have been split by hostilities forever. No,
одну
they
часть
will be
этого
reunited.
другого. Нет,
The unity is still there.
воссоединение произойдет. Оно никуда и не делось.
Why are the Ukrainian authorities dismantling the Ukrainian Orthodox Church?
Растаскивают русскую православную церковь.
Good
Because
question.
it brings together not only the territory,
Объединяет не территорию.
it brings together our souls.
Hmm.
И
No
никому
one will be
не
able to
удастся
separate the
их
soul.
разделить.
Shall we end here, or is there anything else?
No, I think that's great.
Спасибо.
Thank you, Mr. President.
So there you have it, folks. We skipped a little bit. You can go watch the full thing for yourself. But there was the Tucker Carlson interview with Vladimir Putin. And you notice that last thing he said? I think that demonstrates a level of complexity to this war, moral complexity, philosophical, ethnic, national, etc., that, again, a lot of Americans just don't understand, right? When Putin tells that story about how the Ukrainians scream back in Russian saying Russians don't surrender, they understand that in Eastern Europe. Does the average American get that, or do they just hear, oh, you got this democracy fighting this other dictatorship, and it's just like World War II or something like that, right? It's true. It's true. And I think the same is true of the way they speak about Vladimir Putin. And let me be clear, because everyone's going to make the accusation, right, that none of what I said in this interview is a blanket endorsement of the guy, okay? I'm not like, oh... Now, I have joked, quote-unquote, for years that I actually work for Vladimir Putin, but, you know, that's obviously a joke. We only sold the merch, okay? I swear it was just a joke. No, but in all seriousness, but I think this distinction of free democratic leader versus evil dictator is a highly oversimplistic way to look at the modern world, right? And I think in many ways, it's not exactly accurate or true. And I think when you really break it down, you know, a lot of the past in history, and hey, maybe you look back and say maybe it was a little more complex than that, but still, a lot of the past in history, we look at this sort of war between right and wrong, or like this really good guy versus this really bad guy. And when I look at the current world order, I don't see that so much. I see a lot of shades of gray, right? People will say it's about freedom versus authoritarianism, but that certainly is not true and can't explain it. It can't. Because there's less freedom of speech, democracy, and all of that stuff in Ukraine right now than there is in Russia. We say we're defending democracy in Ukraine, but they treat journalists even worse than the Russians do. And I'm not even saying that the Russians treat journalists good, right? So that can't explain it. You know, they say they're about democracy when they're trying to take down the candidate that half the country supports, you know, stuff like that. So I reject, honestly, in many ways, that worldview as a whole, right? I think in many ways, there's and I guess this is something maybe when you get older or you learn more about the world, you start to see that oftentimes the cliche of that is oversimplified, and the real world's a lot more complex than that, right? And so as I brought up when I was watching this, in Vladimir Putin, I don't see a guy who's like some type of evil genocidal maniac. Now, there's definitely things he's done that are probably evil. I'm not saying that's not. But like I said, I see him more so as a ruthless pragmatist, right? So he will do anything it takes to further the interest of Russia or his vision for Russia, right? So when that means trying to appeal to the West, he'll appeal to the West. Appeal to the East, to appeal to China, he'll do that, right? Whatever it needs in the moment. And same thing with, you know, he'll talk about the Soviet Union on one hand and then Orthodox Christianity and appeal to pre-Soviet Russia on the other hand. That's what the guy really is about, right? And, you know, on many ways, I guess my thing about it is I find him as a figure to be pretty interesting, I guess is what I'll say, you know? And that I think that's actually part of the interesting part about actually sitting down and listen to him speak for an extended period of time, which I will be honest, this is really my first time hearing him, is you see a lot of that complexity in his character, right? It's interesting to me. But then when I look at how pragmatic he is, I also turn around and ask the question, well, if our big enemy in terms of the economics, the trade war and all that stuff, and, you know, militarily a little bit, I guess, is China, and this guy, all he really is a ruthless pragmatist, he has no moral opposition to the West. He has a pragmatic opposition to the West because they're acting against his interest. Then why is it this guy, when we claim that China is the number one threat to the United States geopolitically, why is it this guy that we spend so much time and resource saying how much we hate and like closing all doors of negotiation with him? Quite literally. You talk about Ukraine, we shut that off. We won't let Ukraine negotiate. You talk about even back then with NATO and all that stuff, we constantly basically antagonize this guy. He actually tried, because I think, not because he loves the West or loves America, but I think because he's very pragmatic. He was like, okay, let me try to reach out to the world superpower and see if there's something we can do mutually for each other's interests. The world superpower says no. He's in a corner. He goes to China, right? And I think in retrospect, when you look at it, it was very stupid. It's always been stupid. I think it still is stupid to this day. Now, you can make the argument that there's a case to be made. It's too late, right? Putin has already fallen into China's arms, and it's too late. I even now don't necessarily think that's true, to tell you the truth. Because I know he did say a lot of favorable things about China in this interview, and understandably he would, because now they're buddy-buddy right now. But deep down, like I said, he's a ruthless pragmatist. You don't think he's very wary of China at the same time? You don't think China's wary of Russia? Of course they are. Of course they are. What we should be doing, okay, because frankly, I think it's long past the moment that we as Americans sometimes be a little more pragmatic and a little less idealistic when it comes to foreign policy, is say, how can we divide our quote-unquote enemies, I guess, against each other and, kind of play a little game there, right? But of course, this thinking is beyond the pale of the people who run our country, right? And they'll claim to be informed. It's like, no, the average public, the average American just doesn't know what they're talking about. Everyone's misinformed when it comes to foreign policy. We went to Georgetown University. We have worked in the State Department. We know what we are talking about. No, I don't really believe that. I think they're just outright dumb, to tell you the truth. I think they are just dumb, okay? You ask the question, why, when Putin back in the day was trying to reach out to the U.S., were we so antagonistic to him? Yeah, don't get me wrong, there's probably reasons for that on many levels, but really, I have to imagine a lot of that just comes down to pure stupidity. It's really the truth, right? It's stupidity. Because, but these people are so smart. You mean the people who couldn't see 9/11 coming from a mile away? You mean the people, or allegedly, at least according to them, the people who said they wanted to take out ISIS and then basically funded and helped ISIS by backing the Syrian rebel groups, and even before that basically were responsible for the creation of ISIS? You mean the people who couldn't even withdraw from Afghanistan without leaving the Taliban a bunch of our military equipment, right? Like, these people are just, that's the truth, right? The people who run U.S. foreign policy, yes, a lot of them are corrupt. Yes, a lot of them are evil. Yes, a lot of them are compromised. But I think it's also true, a lot of them are just not smart. They are just stupid people, okay? And, I think there's many layers to that, because when you listen to Vladimir Putin speak, you can say whatever you want about him, okay? You can say he's brutal, he's this, he's that. One thing he is stupid, right? He had an answer to everything in that interview. He was sharp. He was ready. No stumble, no nothing, right? Which makes sense. He used to be KGB. He's kind of like probably one of the brightest minds they have in Russia, right? But those types of people, our brightest minds, are not the people running our foreign policy, and that's just the truth. They're just not smart people. And this is a point that Trump used to raise a lot, which is, like, the people in charge of our country are just stupid. And don't get me wrong, I don't, like, you listen to Trump speak, right? He doesn't know nearly the history that Putin does, but at least he has common sense. That's his strength, right? Whereas the people in charge, for the most part, elsewhere in our country, the establishment, you will say, not only are they not smart people, but they also lack common sense. They don't have either, right? So I don't know. That's just honestly the truth about this. Other thing to note, I guess, is, people said this was just going to be a propaganda piece on behalf of Putin. I mean, don't get me wrong. Tucker Carlson wasn't doing a Piers Morgan where every 5 seconds he's like, but you invaded Ukraine, or, the new Piers Morgan line. Actually, Piers Morgan's probably going to tweet out, why didn't you ask Vladimir Putin if he condemns Hamas, right? That's going to come. Like, it wasn't like that type of interview. But a lot of the questions Tucker asked were actually pretty tough, okay? And I know we kind of skipped the beginning part, but Tucker was kind of pushing back, saying, I get the history lesson, but what does it have to do with my question, right? He said that in the beginning. He asked about Gershkovich, which people said he wouldn't have the guts to do because he's just there to do propaganda. He asked about it, okay? Couple difficult questions in there, I don't think it was a puff piece by any means. Sure, he wasn't constantly on the attack, but I wouldn't say it was just glazing Vladimir Putin. Whereas when you listen to Zelensky and the interviews he does with Western media, that's exactly what it is. So I guess that's the other thing that I would note there. Okay. But let's see. I'll get to super chats in a second. So feel free to send in any super chats. Before we end the stream, we will read some. So we got a couple minutes. Feel free to do so. In the meantime, though, since we have kind of just kept it on the screen and not particularly talked about it, folks, in other news, Donald Trump won the Republican primary, I guess technically last night, in the state of Nevada by, I'm trying to flip this screen right here. Hold on. It's clearly backwards because I was, doing it for the Putin interview. But yeah, with 1% of the votes in, I mean, this is not surprising to anyone. He's basically probably going to win it unanimously. Ryan Binkley has a total of 9 votes. I know, very impressive. And Nikki Haley was not even on this ballot, right? So obviously we have the concern that maybe Donald Trump could see a formidable challenge from quote unquote no